The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 9. Chapter 18. The Grey Tent in the Evening. On the day that the hunted unicorn crossed the Valley of Earl, Alveric had wandered for over 11 years. For more than 10 years, a company of 6, they went by the backs of the houses by the edge of the fields we know, and camped at evenings with their queer material hung greyly on poles. And whether or not the strange romance of their quest mirrored itself in all the things about them, those camps of theirs seemed always the strangest things in the landscape, and as evening grew greyer around them, their romance and mystery grew. And, for all the vehemence of Alveric's ambition, they travelled leisurely and lazily. Sometimes, in a pleasant camp, they stayed for 3 days. Then they went strolling on. 9 or 10 miles they would march, and then they would camp again. Some day Alveric felt sure in his heart that he would see that border of twilight. Some day they would enter Elfland, and in Elfland he knew that time was not as here. He would meet Lyrazel, unaged in Elfland, with never one smile lost to the raging years, never a furrow worn by the ruin of time. This was his hope, and it led his queer company on from camp to camp, and cheered them round the fire on the lonely evenings, and brought them far to the north, travelling all along the edge of the fields we know, where all men's faces turned the other way, and the 6 wanderers went unseen and unheeded. Only the mind of Vand hung back from their hope, and more every year his reason denied the lure that was leading the rest. And then one day he lost his faith in Elfland. After that he only followed until a day when the wind was full of rain, and all were cold and wet and the horses weary. He left them then. And Rannoch followed because he had no hope in his heart and wished to wander from sorrow, until one day when all the blackbirds were singing in trees of the fields we know, and his hopelessness left him in the glittering sunshine, and he thought of the cosy homes and the haunts of men. And soon he too passed out of the camp one evening and set off for the pleasant lands. And now the 4 that were left were all of one mind, and under the wet coarse cloth that they hung on poles there was deep content in the evenings. For Alveric clung to his hope with all the strength of his race, that had once won Earl in old battles and held it for centuries long. And in the vacant minds of Niv and Zend, this idea grew strong and big, like some rare flower that a gardener may plant by chance in a wild, untended place. And Thil sung of the hope, and all of his wild fancies that roamed after song decked Alveric's quest with more and more of glamour. So all were of one mind, and greater quests, whether mad or sane, have prospered when this was so, and greater quests have failed when it was otherwise. They had gone northward for years along the backs of those houses, and then one day they would turn eastward wherever a certain look in the sky or a touch of weirdness at evening, or a mere prophecy of Niv's seemed to suggest the proximity of Elfland. Upon such occasions they would travel over the rocks that for all these years lay bordering the fields we know, until Alveric saw that provisions for men and horses would barely bring them back to the houses of men. Then he would turn again, but Niv would have led them still onwards over the rocks, for his enthusiasm grew as they went. And Thil sang to them, prophesying success, and Zend would say that he saw the peaks and the spires of Elfland. Only Alveric was wise, and so they would come to the houses of men again, and buy more provisions, and Niv and Zend and Thil would babble of the quest, pouring out the enthusiasm that burned in their hearts. But Alveric did not speak of it, for he had learned that men in those fields neither speak of nor look towards Elfland, although he had not learned why. Soon they were on again, and the folk that had sold them the produce of fields, we know, gazed curiously after them as they went, as though they thought that from madness alone or from dreams inspired by the moon came all the talk they had heard from Niv and Zend and Thul. Thus they always travelled on, always seeking new points from which to discover Elfland, and on the left of them blew scents from the fields we know, the scent of lilac from cottage gardens in May, and then the scent of the white thorn, and then of roses, till all the air was heavy with new-mown hay. They heard the low of cattle away on their left, heard human voices, heard partridges calling, heard all the sounds that go up from happy farms. And on their right was always the desolate land, always the rocks, and never grass nor a flower. They had the companionship of men no more, and yet they could not find Elfland. In such a case they needed the songs of Thil and the sure hope of Niv. And the talk of Alveric's quest spread through the land and overtook his wanderings, till all men that he passed by knew his story, and from some he had the contempt that some men give to those who dedicate their days to a quest, and from others he had honour. But all he asked for was provender, and this he bought where they brought it. So they went on. Like legendary things, they passed along the backs of the houses, putting up their grey shapeless tent in the grey evenings. They came as quietly as rain and went away like mists, drifting. There were jests about them, and songs, and the songs outlasted the jests. At last they became a legend, which haunted those farms forever. They were spoken of when men told of hopeless quests, and held up to laughter or glory, whichever men had to give. And all the while the King of Elfland watched, for he knew by magic when Alveric's sword drew near. It had troubled his kingdom once, and the King of Elfland knew well the flavour of thunderbolt iron when he felt it loom in the air. From this he had withdrawn his frontiers far, leaving all that ragged land deserted of Elfland, and though he knew not the length of human journeys, he had left a space that to cross would weary the comet, and rightly deemed himself safe. But when Alveric with his sword was far to the north, the Elf King loosened his grip with which he had withdrawn Elfland, as the moon that withdraws the tide lets it flow back again, and Elfland came racing back as the tide over flat sands. With a long ribbon of twilight at its edge, it floated back over the waste of rocks. With old songs it came, with old dreams and with old voices. And in a while the frontier of twilight lay flashing and glimmering near the fields we know, like an endless summer evening that lingers on out of the golden age. But bleak and far to the north where Alveric wandered, the limitless rocks still heaped the desolate land. Only to fields from which he and his sword and his adventurous band were remotely gone, that mighty inlet of Elfland came lapping back. So that close again to the leather worker's cottage and to the farms of his neighbourhood, a bare 3 fields away, lay the land that was heaped and piled with all the wonder for which poets seek so hard. The very treasury of all romantic things, and the elfin mountains gazed over the border serenely as though their pale blue peaks had never moved. And here the unicorns fed along the border as was their custom to do, feeding sometimes in Elfland, which is the home of all fabulous things, cropping lilies below the slope of the elfin mountains, and sometimes slipping through the border of twilight at evening when all our fields are still to feed upon earthly grass. It is because of this craving for earthly grass that comes on them now and then, as the red deer and highland mountains crave once a year for the sea, that, fabulous though they are on account of their birth in Elfland, their existence is nevertheless known among men. The fox, which is born to our fields, also crosses the frontier, going into the border of twilight at certain seasons. It is thence that he gets the romance with which he comes back to our fields. He also is fabulous, but only in Elfland, as the unicorns are fabulous here. And seldom the folk on those farms saw the unicorns, even dim in the gloaming, for their faces were turned forever away from Elfland. The wonder, the beauty, the glamour, the story of Elfland were for minds that had leisure to care for such things as these. But the crops needed these men, and the beasts that were not fabulous, and the thatch, and the hedges, and 1,000 things. Barely at the end of each day they won their fight against winter. They knew well that if they let a thought of theirs turn but for a moment towards Elfland, its glory would grip them soon and take all their leisure away, and there would be no time left to mend thatch or hedge or to plough the fields we know. But Orion, lured by the sound of the horns that blew from Elfland at evening, and that some elvish attuning of his ears to magical things caused him alone in those fields to hear, came with his hounds to a field across which ran the frontier of twilight, and found the unicorns there late on an evening. And, slipping along a hedge of the little field, with his hounds padding behind him, he came between a unicorn and the frontier and cut it off from Elfland. This was the unicorn that, with flashing neck, covered with flecks of foam that shone silvery in the starlight, panting, harried and weary, came across the Valley of Earl like an inspiration, like a new dynasty to a custom-weary land, like news of a happier continent found far off by suddenly returned seafaring men. Chapter 19. 12 Old Men Without Magic. Now few things pass by a village and leave no talk behind them. Nor did this unicorn, for the 3 that saw it going in by the starlight immediately told their families, and many of these ran from their houses to tell the good news to others. For all strange news was accounted good in Earl because of the talk that it made, and talk was held to be needful when work was over to pass the evening away. So they talked long of the unicorn. And, after a day or two in the forge of Gnarl, the Parliament of Earl was met again, seated by mugs of mead discussing the unicorn. And some rejoiced and said that Orion was magic because unicorns were of magic stock and came from beyond our fields. Therefore, said one, he has been to lands of which it does not become us to speak, and it is magic, as all things are which dwell over there. And some agreed and held their plans had come to fruition. But others said that the beast went by in the starlight, if beast it were, and who could say it was a unicorn? And one said that in the starlight it was hard to see at all, and another said unicorns were hard to recognise. And then they began to discuss the size and the shape of these beasts and all the known legends that told them, and came no nearer to agreeing together whether or not their lord had hunted a unicorn. Till, at last, Gnarl, seeing that they would not thus come by the truth, and deeming it necessary that the fact should be established one way or the other, forever rose up and told them the time had come for the vote. So, by a method they have of casting shells of various colours into a horn that was passed from man to man, they voted about the unicorn as Gnarl had commanded. And a hush fell, and Gnarl counted. And it was seen to have been established by vote that there had been no unicorn. Sorrowfully then, that Parliament of Earl saw that their plans to have a magic lord had failed. They were all old men, and the hope that they had had for so long being gone, they turned less easily to new plans than they had to the plan that they had made so long ago. What should they do now? They said. How come by magic? What could they do that the world should remember Earl? 12 old men without magic. They sat there over their mead, and it could not lighten their sadness. But Orion was away with his hounds near the great inlet of Elfland, where it lay as it were at high tide, touching the very grass of the fields we know. He went there at evening when the horns blew clear to guide him, and waited there all quiet at the edge of those fields for the unicorns to steal across the border, for he hunted stags no more. And as he went over those fields in the late afternoon, folk working on the farm would greet him cheerily, but when he still went eastward they spoke to him less and less, till at last, when he neared the border and still kept on, they looked his way no more, but left him and his hounds to their own devices. And by the time the sun had set, he would be standing quiet by a hedge that ran right down into the frontier of twilight, with his hounds all gathered close in under the hedge, with his eye on them lest one of them dared to move. And the pigeons would come home to the trees of the fields we know, and twittering starlings, and the elfin horns would blow clear, silver, magical music, thrilling the chilled air, and all the colours of clouds would go suddenly changing. It was then, in the failing light, in the darkening of colours, that Orion would watch for a dim white shape stepping out of the border of twilight. And this evening, just as he hushed a hound with his hand, just as all our fields went dim, there slipped a great white unicorn out of the border, still munching lilies such as never grew in any fields of ours. He came, a whiteness on perfectly silent feet, 4 or 5 yards into the fields we know, and stood there still as moonlight, and listened, and listened, and listened. Orion never moved, and he kept his hounds silent by some power he had, or by some wisdom of theirs. And in 5 minutes the unicorn made a step or two forward, and began to crop the long, sweet, earthy grasses. And as soon as he moved, there came others through the deep blue border of twilight, and all at once there were 5 of them feeding there. And still Orion stood with his hounds and waited. Little by little, the unicorns moved further away from the border, lured further and further into the fields. We know, by the deep, rich, earthy grasses on which all 5 of them browsed in the silent evening. If a dog barked, even if a late cock crew, up went all their ears at once, and they stood watchful, not trusting anything in the fields of men, or venturing into them far. But at last, the one that had come first through the twilight got so far from his magical home that Orion was able to run between him and the frontier, and his hounds came behind him. And then had Orion been toying with the chase, then had he hunted but for an idle whim, and not for the deep love of the huntsman's craft that only huntsmen know, then had he lost everything, for his hounds would have chased the nearest unicorns, and they would have been in a moment across the frontier and lost. And if the hounds had followed to chase the furthest, watching all the while to see if any hound would try to pursue the other, and only one began to, but Orion's whip was ready, and so he cut his quarry off from its home, and his hounds, for the second time, were in full cry after a unicorn. As soon as the unicorn heard the feet of the hounds, and saw with one flash of his eye that he could not get to his enchanted home, he shot forward with a sudden spring of his limbs, and went like an arrow over the fields we know. When he came to hedges, he did not seem to gather his limbs to leap, but seemed to glide over them with motionless muscles, galloping again when he touched the grass once more. In the first rush, the hounds drew far ahead of Orion, and this enabled him to head the unicorn off whenever it tried to turn into the magical land. And at such turnings he came near his hounds again. And the third time that Orion turned the unicorn, it galloped straight away, and so continued over the fields of men. The cry of the hounds went through the calm of the evening like a long ripple across a sleeping lake, following the unseen way of some strange diver. In that straight gallop, the unicorn gained so much on the hounds that soon Orion only saw him far off, a white spot moving along a slope in the gloaming. Then it reached the top of a valley and passed from view. But that strong, queer scent that leads the hounds like a song remained clear on the grass, and they never checked or faltered except for a moment at streams. Even there, their ranging noses picked up the magical scent before Orion came up to give them his aid. And as the hunt went on, the daylight faded away till the sky was all prepared for the coming of the stars, and 1 or 2 stars appeared, and a mist came up from the streams and spread all white over the fields, till they could not have seen the unicorn if he had been close before them. The very trees seemed sleeping. They passed by little houses, lonely, sheltered by elms, shut off by high hedges of yew from those that roamed the fields. Houses that Orion had never seen or known till the chance course of this unicorn brought him suddenly past their doors. Dogs barked as they passed and continued barking long, for that magical scent on the air and the rush and the voice of the pack told them that something strange was afoot, and at first they barked because they would have shared in what was afoot, and afterwards to warn their masters about the strangeness. They barked long through the evening, and once, as they passed a little house in a cluster of old thorns, a door suddenly opened and a woman stood gazing to see them go by. She could have seen no more than a grey shapes, but Orion, in the moment as he passed, saw all the glow of the house and the yellow light streaming out into the cold. The merry warmth cheered him, and he would have rested a while in that little oasis of man in the lonely fields. But the hounds went on, and he followed, and those in the houses heard the cry go past like the sound of a trumpet, whose echoes go fading away amongst the furthest hills. A fox heard them coming, and stood quite still and listened. At first he was puzzled, then he caught the scent of the unicorn, and all was clear to him, for he knew by the magic flavour that it was something coming from Elfland. But when sheep caught the scent, they were terrified and ran all huddled together until they could run no more. Cattle leapt up from their sleep, gazed dreamily and wondered, but the unicorn went through them and away, as some rose-scented breeze that had strayed from valley gardens into the streets of a city slips through the noisy traffic and is gone. Soon all the stars were looking on those quiet fields through which the hunt went with its exultation, a line of vehement life cleaving through sleep and silence. And now the unicorn, far out of sight, though he was no longer, gained a little at every hedge. For at first he lost no more pace at any hedge than a bird loses passing clear of a cloud, while the great hounds struggled through what gaps they could find, or lay on their sides and wriggled between the stems of the bushes. But now he gathered his strength with more effort at every hedge, and sometimes hit the top of the edge and stumbled. He was galloping slower too, for this was a journey such as no unicorn made through the deep calm of Elfland, and something told the tired hounds they were drawing nearer, and a new joy entered their voices. They crossed a few more black hedges, and then there loomed before them the dark of a wood. When the unicorn entered the wood, the voices of the hounds were clear in his ears. A pair of foxes saw him going slowly, and they ran along beside him to see what would befall the magic creature, coming weary to them from Elfland. One on each side they ran, keeping his slow pace and watching him, and they had no fear of the hounds, though they heard their cry, for they knew that nothing that followed that magical scent would turn aside from any earthly thing. So he went labouring through the woods, and the foxes watched him curiously all the way. The hounds entered the woods, and the great oaks rang with the sound of them, and Orion followed with an enduring speed that might have got from our fields, or that might have come to him over the border from Elfland. The dark of the wood was intense, but he followed his hounds' cries, and they did not need to see with that wonderful scent to guide them. They never wavered as they followed that scent, but went on through gloaming and starlight. It was not like any hunt of fox or stag, for another fox would cross the line of a fox, or a stag must pass through a herd of stags and hinds. Even a flock of sheep will bewilder hounds by crossing the line they follow. But this unicorn was the only magical thing in all our fields that night, and his scent lay unmistakably over the earthy grass, a burning, pungent flavour of enchantment amongst the things of every day. They hunted him clear through the wood and down it to a valley, the 2 foxes keeping with him and watching still. He picked his feet carefully as he went down the hill, as though his weight hurt them when he descended the slope, yet his pace was as fast as that of the hounds going down. Then he went a little way along the trough of the valley, turning to his left as soon as he came down the hill. But the hounds gained on him then, and he turned for the opposite slope. And then his weariness could be concealed no longer, the thing that all wild creatures conceal to the last. He toiled over every step as though his legs dragged his body heavily. Orion saw him from the opposite slope, and when the unicorn got to the top, the hounds were close behind him, so that he suddenly whipped round his great single horn and stood before them, threatening. Then the hounds bayed about him, but the horn waved and bowed with such swift grace that no hound got a grip. They knew death when they saw it, and eager though they were to fasten upon him, they leapt back from that flashing horn. Then Orion came up with his bow, but he would not shoot, perhaps because it was hard to put an arrow safely past his pack of hounds, perhaps because of a feeling such as we have today, and which is no new thing among us, that it was unfair to the unicorn. Instead, he drew an old sword that he was wearing, and advanced through his hounds and engaged that deadly horn. And the unicorn arched his neck, and the horn flashed at Orion, and weary though the unicorn was, yet a mighty force remained in that muscular neck to drive the blow that he aimed, and Orion barely parried. He thrust at the unicorn's throat, but the great horn tossed the sword aside from its aim and again lunged at Orion. Again he parried with the whole weight of his arm, and had but an inch to spare. He thrust again at the throat, and the unicorn parried the sword thrust almost contemptuously. Again and again the unicorn aimed fair at Orion's heart. The huge white beast stepped forward, pressing Orion back. That graceful bowing neck, with all its wide arch of hard muscle, driving the deadly horn, was wearying Orion's arm. Once more he thrust and failed. He saw the unicorn's eye flash wickedly in the starlight. He saw all white before him, the fearful arch of its neck. He knew he could turn aside its heavy blows no more. And then a hound got a grip in front of the right shoulder. No moments passed before many another hound leapt onto the unicorn, each with a chosen grip, for all that they looked like a rabble rolling and heaving by chance. Orion thrust no more, for many hounds all at once were between him and his enemy's throat. Awful groans came from the unicorn, such sounds as are not heard in the fields we know. And then there was no sound, but the deep growl of the hounds that roared over the wonderful carcass as they wallowed in fabulous blood. End of Part 9. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.